Okay, folks, welcome to our final meeting on the 1844 Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, or the Paris Manuscripts by Marx. Uh, I thought it might be interesting for us to flag a couple things from last time, and that is the definition that Marx develops of society. We remember that society is talked about on page 128 as a sort of sensuous sphere that the worker is deprived of in capitalist society. And this actually, I was doing some research that I wanted to share with you because it is uh, very much helpful to understand the political practice of Marx and later of Engels at the time of 1844 as advocating what they called a social revolution, which would be in distinction from a political revolution. And this is a good way to understand why it is that Marx is critical of the tradition of the so-called rights of man coming out of the Jacobins. He's critical of it, as we know, in 1844 in this text. And part of that has to do with a fundamental skepticism that Marx has about the possibility of political revolution for the working class. Another part of that, and I really get this from Richard Hunt's biography, The Political Ideas of Marx and Engels, is that Marx is searching for a political vehicle or organization that can adequately represent the problem of interpretation and the problem of representation are almost conflated, as Etienne Balibar mentions in his book, The Philosophy of Marx. And at the time, he was part of a thing called the Communist League. And this was a largely petty bourgeois organization, and it was disconnected from the working class primarily. It was full of true socialists. It was full of messianic socialists like Willem Weitling, for example. Moses Hess was a fellow traveler of this. And Marx is not yet put into exile in Brussels. And in Brussels, when he's in exile, that's when he writes the so-called Theses on Feuerbach. But the Theses on Feuerbach, which are written 1 year after this, were, of course, never meant for publication. Balibar says the Theses on Feuerbach were meant as an inspirational memo that Marx and Engels themselves would read to re-ground their political position. But they contain a certain radicalism precisely because Marx is basically on police watch. He's basically on police watch. He's kind of in house arrest when he writes the Theses on Feuerbach. So 1844, he's in a restless state of transition, both philosophically and politically, right? And there's a lot to be said about that, but I just want to draw your attention to how the so-called rights of man and the representation of the theory of revolution changes in 1 year. Listen to what Marx says 1 year after in 1845. A revolution is necessary, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can succeed only by a revolution in getting rid of all the traditional muck and become capable of establishing society anew. A social revolution, gentlemen, is something quite different from the political revolutions which have taken place so far. It is not directed, as these have been, against the property of monopoly, but against the monopoly of property. A social revolution, gentlemen, this is a speech that he's giving, right, is the open war of the poor against the rich. Either the rebellious party only attacks the appearance, not the essence, only the form, not the thing itself, or it goes for the thing itself, and it grasps the evil by the root. In the first case, private property. But then, so that sounds very 1844-ish, right? However, at the same time, in 1845, Engels, and this is part of the argument, by the way, of Althusser, right? Which is that the Theses on Feuerbach is such a significant philosophical break from 1844 because Marx had imbued Engels's theory of history, right? Historical materialism. And what's lacking are two things: stages of historical development of capitalism in 1844 manuscripts, and an adequate theory of the division of labor, which would allow Marx to theorize this notion of the proletariat in the particular way that he theorizes it in the thesis on Feuerbach. But once Engels, in the German ideology and in the theses, is infused there, note what Engels says about the theory of revolution and how it changes. This is actually in 1846. He says the principles of social and political regeneration have been around for over 50 years. Universal suffrage, direct election, paid representation, these are the essential conditions of political sovereignty. Equality, liberty, fraternity, these are the principles which ought to rule all social institutions. So, as Neil Davidson also discusses in this book I'm reading about the nature of the bourgeois revolutions in the time of Marx and Engels, you see the shift that Engels encourages in Marx is to conceive of solidarity with bourgeois class as the strategic leverage point for the liberation of the proletariat. Okay. So I thought that was an interesting point because I was struggling with an understanding of Marx's idea of revolution as social revolution, and it felt quite vague to me. So I thought some of that historical context might be of interest and helpful. So we have two sections to look at tonight: the power of money in bourgeois society, and then the final section, which is called Critique of the Hegelian Dialectic and Philosophy as a Whole. And then we're done with the text. One of the lingering questions that has emerged has been the problem of the immiseration thesis, which has come up multiple times. And I've invited Matilda to give a short presentation on Marx's theory of immiseration, and both in this text, but also kind of beyond, so that we can get a better sense of this conundrum. There are, I think, philosophical reasons why Marx is interested in talking about the suffering of workers in this. But Matilda, if you wouldn't mind, I don't know how much time you have prepared, but I thought that might be useful for you to jump in at this point, and then we'll go immediately to the text.
Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, yeah, sorry, mic might be bad, but thank you for giving me some time for this, Daniel. I found that I didn't really know much about the immiseration thesis before going on this investigation, besides reading the 1844 manuscripts. It seemed to me like there was just this relative immiseration of the working class in comparison to the collection of material wealth, like with the capitalists. And I really don't necessarily see evidence in the 1844 manuscripts for like some sort of absolute immiseration of the worker. And if anyone had quotes for that, that would be wonderful. There's the wages of labor section at the very beginning, which kind of outline his basic view on what wages are doing. And it might be useful just to look at that, the first kind of section of that. He says, wages are determined through the antagonistic struggle between capitalist and worker. Victory goes necessarily to the capitalist. The capitalist can live longer without the worker than can the worker without the capitalist. Combination among the capitalists is customary and effective. Workers' combinations is prohibited and painful. And its consequences for them. Besides, the landowner and the capitalists can augment their revenues with the fruits of industry. The worker has neither ground rent nor interest on capital to supplement his industrial income. Hence, the intensity of competition among the workers. Thus, only the worker is the separation of thus only for the worker is the separation of capital, landed property, and labor an inevitable, essential, detrimental separation. Capital and landed property need not remain fixed in this abstraction, as must the labor of the worker. Well, perhaps this might be useful. The lowest and only necessary wage rate is that providing for the subsistence of the worker for the duration of his work, and as much more as is necessary for him to support a family, and for the race of laborers not to die out. The ordinary wage, according to Smith, is the lowest compatible with common humanity. Okay, well, it's kind of, so I've tried, I feel like his theory of wages is quite undeveloped in 1844. And prior to this, there was Ricardo and Malthus kind of trying to make sense of how wages were set. And I think in general, that's like what people call the iron law of wages. And sorry, some of this is a bit of a series of quotes, but so in looking, so I knew some of the 1844, and then I went to the Wikipedia page for the immiseration thesis, which has proved to really complicate the investigation because there's a ton of errors in the page. And like, in connection to this there's this other section where they connect a dialectic of enlightenment quote. So it seems like these two things are related to each other. And I think that's where some of the confusion and the discussion was coming from, is like the immiseration thesis is related to a theory of wages. And the quotation of Adorno in here is related to the primary contradiction capital. And those two things are separate. And so I kind of started trying to understand the Adorno quote and neglected the theory of wages until just today a little bit, where I came across some important things. But let me just continue a little longer with the wage theory, and then I'll get to the Adorno quote. Basically, let's see. It's from the Wikipedia page, it says, in Karl Marx's early writings, he was influenced by David Ricardo's theory of wages, which held that wages tended down to a subsistence minimum. And this was the iron law of wages, coined by Ferdinand Lassalle later. And an example that they provide here is, as means are constantly being found for the maintenance of labor on cheaper and more wretched food, the minimum of wages is constantly sinking. Anywho, there's this idea that like in times where profit is good and wages take a share in that, according to the old theory, the population of workers just rises and cancels out that wage surplus that's kind of gained from business doing well. And then in times when business is doing bad, wages don't necessarily go down, people just die off. And so there's just like this idea that there's this iron law that like wages are kind of locked to this subsistence level. And I think Marx criticizes this a lot, and in 1849, he has Wages and Capital, I think is something, a pamphlet he writes, and he starts to distinguish between real wages and relative wages. And I'm gonna read a little bit on this because I found this really enlightening. This is from Rosdolsky's work that has a section on the immiseration thesis that I think is really essential. I found it this morning and I've tried to been analyzing it, but I think if you're curious about his theory of wages, throughout his work, the Rosdolsky text called, let's see here. Making of Marx's Capital has a section on Marx's wage theory and the immiseration thesis. And here's some quotes from it. This is talking about real and relative wages. In 1849, he wrote Wage, Labor, and Capital, and a quote, but neither nominal wages, that is the sum of money for which the worker sells himself to the capitalist, nor real wages, that is the sum of commodities which he can buy from this money, or that he can buy for this money, exhaust the relations contained in wages. Wages are, above all, also determined by their relation to the gain, to the profit of the capitalist, comparative relative wages. Real wages express the price of labor in relation to the price of other commodities. Real wages in that sense would be like, because wages are set by the value, the social, like by the value that it costs to reproduce them, the real wages kind of express this, express the price of labor in relation to the price of other commodities. And so as production becomes more advanced, commodities become cheaper, and so the reproduction of the workers becomes cheaper in a sense, socially. But relative wages, on the other hand, express the share of direct labor in the new value it has created in relation to the share which falls to accumulated labor, to capital. So this is where we get wealth accumulates at one pole and misery of the workers accumulates at the other. Relative wages is what's going to be essential for Marx's theory. And this next quote by Rosa Luxemburg speaks to what is essential about relative wages in relationship to the project of Marx's work. So capitalist production cannot take one step forward without squeezing the worker's share of the social product. With every new technical discovery, improvement of machinery, every new application of steam and electricity in production and commerce, the worker's share in the product gets smaller and that of the capitalist larger. It is this quiet, invisible power, a simple mechanical effect of commodity production and competition, which deprives the worker of a larger share of his product. The personal role of the exploiter is still visible where the question is that of absolute wages, real living standards. A wage reduction, which leads to a depression of the real standard of living of the workers, is a visible attack by the capitalists against the workers and will be responded to with an immediate struggle wherever the influence of unions extends. That is if the business owner decides that they don't need to pay you as much as they used to. But the situation is quite different, where an invisible reduction in wages takes place as the result of straightforward technical progress, inventions, and the introduction of machines, improvements in transportation, etc. Quote, the effects of all these forms of progress on the relative wages of the workers result quite automatically from commodity production and the commodity character of labor power. Thus, the struggle against the fall in relative wages also implies a struggle against the commodity character of labor power, that is, against capitalist production as a whole. Thus, the struggle against the fall in relative wages is no longer a struggle on the basis of the commodity economy, but a revolutionary, subversive attack on the existence of this economy. It is the socialist movement of the proletariat. And it is, so that's the end of the Luxemburg quote. And Rostowski kind of makes a little point on this, is it now becomes clear why Marx fought so fiercely against Lassalle's iron law of wages, not only because it was built upon Malthus's doctrine of population and contradicted the facts, but also because it overlooked the category of relative wages and the revolutionary objectives which emerged from it. Marx's own economic theory led to the discovery that the system of wage labor is fundamentally a system of slavery, quote, a system of slavery, and indeed of a slavery which becomes more severe in proportion as the social productive forces of labor develop, whether the worker receives better or worse payment, end quote. And that consequently, the evil of the system can only be overcome with the abolition of wage labor itself. And finally, from Rostowski, I just lost my page. Sorry, one second. For we can still read, this is Rostowski commenting on whether he can notice the iron law of wages earlier than 1849. And we can read in the Communist Manifesto, written in 1847, quote, "The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeoisie. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth." And he says, the Communist Manifesto is the only place where we find the doctrine that wages are at their minimum. And he goes on to say that the Communist Manifesto is a political tract. It's not necessarily a piece of economic theory, and that it is historically conditioned because the 1840s to the 60s were a very desperate period of time. It makes sense to me to make a political statement that Marx might speak loosely in that context. And that is really, there's very few reference quotes that I found that would suggest he believed in the iron law of wages. And we know that he disputed them very fiercely throughout his life. And so that's kind of my report on wages, is the introduction of relative wages as compared to real. And this goes on to get developed much more deeply in his later works.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. That's really helpful. People can jump in with any questions. Feel free to raise your hand. That's really excellent. Because again, I think it ties to the theory of social revolution that Marx is working with at this time. Because part of what we know from the actual political activity of Marx and Engels under the rubric or the strategy of social revolution is that they actually were not involved with direct agitation. So one of the things I find interesting about the immiseration thesis and about the thesis of social revolution is that it strikes me as quite anarchist, maybe, or sort of like, I don't want to say ultra leftist because I know that that's a pejorative for people. And it's also anachronistic to call it ultra leftist too. Like you're applying a kind of post-Leninist concept back. Although it still strikes me as a strange theory of revolution personally. But it does make sense if you hold to the immiseration thesis, right? It does cohere. But I think furthermore, the dialectic of enlightenment and the Adorno treatment of immiseration thesis in post-war capitalism is worth reading because that whole dynamic slightly changes from this 19th century valence, by the way. So just wanted to throw that out there as something to look at. And thank you for that background. Let us jump into the text.
Sure.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just real quick, I did read Pollock's State Capitalism.
Pollock. Yes. Yes.
And I think if you're interested, I mean, like that's the dialectic of enlightenment is dedicated to Pollock, and it really, I think, could only come about theoretically after Pollock's work, State Capitalism. It's not very long. It's just actually just like a 13-page essay, but it's connected to. I suggest reading the historical materialism section of Socialism from Utopian to Scientific for Engels to get the orthodox doctrine of the primary contradiction, and then to read Pollock's essay to see how it suspends this primary contradiction that Engels thought that once monopoly developed, that the people would realize that they were being dominated directly. And what Pollock introduces is that these state capitalist countries have introduced these like pseudo markets and have like created a play of competition. And actually that competition is not operating on the same basis that it once did. And that the economy has been taken over by a private clique that has a plan, and that it is, and so like the desperation you see in the dialectic of enlightenment is directly connected to Pollock's theories, which I found to be very interesting, but not necessarily, maybe not dubious, but his diagnosis is not, needs to be considered further, I think. And
I
I
see.
would, I think the contrast between Grossman and Pollock is a very instructive one.
Yeah,
Grossman held more to the traditional theory of the breakdown of capitalism that Marx and Engels did, and that's my speech. That's the end of my speech. Thank you.
yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I thought that might be interesting for folks, and I think also that it makes sense why the 1844 manuscripts, when they appear in the early 30s, we've touched on this in multiple different ways, but it now I think makes clear sense why the theory of revolution that is on offer in this text um, sort of can lead a thinker, a theorist, to all kinds of different conclusions, especially in the wake of like state socialism and the horrors of certain forms of state socialism. Because here we're given something like Marx gives a speech shortly after, or shortly around like a year after 1844. And one of the things he says that is so interesting is that he basically makes this argument because again, Marx is basically saying we need to break from this is the idea. We need to break from revolution thought in terms of antagonistic classes. That's the heart of the idea. And then I would furthermore speculate that part of the immiseration thesis lends itself to a kind of, let's say, post-class or non-class antagonism theory of revolution. That's why Marx can say we can eschew the rights of man. That's why Marx can say we don't need to rely on bourgeoisie in some sense, right? And then how that gets funneled back into the certain kind of dialectical naturalism that he's developing and this certain idea of um, a certain alternative public sphere, right? Based on the development of a different both intellectual sensibility of the working class, of the proletariat, but also based on a completely different conception of communism than the communism that was around. So you can sort of see that all of that is inviting political organization as a vehicle to express it, but Marx lacks that. So it's a sort of, and the other thing I was realizing is that Gramsci, who's I think one of the best readers in the Marxist tradition, I recently learned that Gramsci never knew about the 1844 manuscripts. Isn't that amazing? To think what Gramsci would have done with these texts. That is an interesting thing, in my opinion, to think about. Okay, let's get into the text now that we've taken like half an hour with those digressions, but they were very helpful. Thank you. So we have 5 movements that opened the section on the power of money in bourgeois society. And these movements are about what Marx refers to as the ontological affirmation of essential being of nature, right? And so these are quite incredible. Um, we can just list them very quickly. Um, so Marx says if man's feelings and passions are not merely anthropological phenomenon, and by that, that is a reference to Feuerbach. Hmm? This is also a reason why I feel that what he's doing here is going beyond Feuerbach, personally, because you see a lot of Marxists think that he's caught within the matrices of Feuerbach. I don't think that he is, but that's a question for us to see and debate. Uh, so if they're not merely anthropological phenomenon, but they're truly ontological affirmations of essential being, right, of nature, and if they are only really affirmed because their object exists for them as an object of sense, this means one, uh, they are determined by the given mode of production, whether that mode of production be capitalist, feudalist, socialist. Okay. but he doesn't have that theory of the stages of modes of production that they develop in German ideology, but it's referenced. Okay. Two, wherever the sensuous affirmation is the direct annulment of the object, then you get the affirmation of that object. So that is basically a kind of reference to like the basic Hegelian notion of the negation of the negation. And then he says, number three, that within the world of private property, enjoyment is an enjoyment that has an alterity to the other. And then he says, number four, it is only in private property that this ontological essence of human passion uh, can express itself as a totality, okay, and in so doing, offer us a science of humanity, okay, that is the product of man's, and that science is the product of man's establishment of himself as a practical activity in the world. Okay. So you see the liberatory theological impulse about the realization of a higher science of humanity that political economy allows us to see, and that vulgar socialism allows us to see by negating the dominance of private property, right? So all of those things should not be seen as purely negative affirmations. No, they're pointing to something. Um, Number five, the meaning of private property, once it is liberated from its estrangement, which vulgar communists are not capable of liberating, um, will present this sort of subsumption of the natural object in a way which is um, no longer mediated by the same form of estrangement. It doesn't mean that it's a blissful, I don't know, naive idea of a kind of utopian naturalism as I read it. But it's rather a kind of more it's a coming into a dependence that is of a different status than capitalist private property. So those are the first five movements. Now, these obviously will repeat when we turn to a consideration on Hegel, but I want to stop and invite folks to jump in here because I am getting a lot of resonance with the Spinozist notion of the conatus, okay, in terms of this object, which when Marx uses the term suffering, right, is striving. Another way to translate that would be striving in the in relation to this higher object. Okay. And there is also, therefore, the development of a kind of tripartite relationality to this third object, to this sort of sphere of otherness that only private property really opens up. And so there's much to be said on this before we get to money, because um, money it comes in to determine the falsity, right, of a certain form of omnipotence, which proves the upside down world, the upside down basis of the regime of private property, right? But again, Marx is opening with a kind of horizon of something that might point beyond it. So I don't know what folks want to say about this opening sequence, or we could also just jump right into what he says about money. The pimp between man's need and his object, right? Because again, we are talking about how what money does is create a scene of a fictitious um, object and a form of dependency that is like not graspable or not realizable by more than by the vast majority of the population. So in this sense, um, money functions to um, I don't know, cover over this uh, possible relation that man could have to the sensuous object, right? So please feel free to jump in if you guys have notes on this. But I mean, I think there's a lot to be said here regarding, and I know a lot of you all are interested in this, how this might link us to psychoanalysis. Um, and I think that one of the interesting things here, given that Marx is talking so much about um, enjoyment, that something must be said um, regarding this relation, right? Because in a sense, Marx will say in the second volume of Capital that um, capitalism already abolishes itself, excuse me, when we assume that it is enjoyment that is the driving motive and not enrichment itself. So there is a sense in which um, the reign of private property and the uh, I don't know, the tyranny and the domination that it subjugates us to, based on these two theories of demand that he develops down on page 138, right? Both demand of what he calls effective and ineffective demand. Uh, basically creates a kind of hollowed out subjectivity that circumscribes forms of enjoyment in some ways, right? That basically, and I love, of course, all of these references to Shakespeare, um, which I found quite interesting. But the point being is that like man is rendered in a kind of fictional relationship to enjoyment, and at the same time, we know from Freud and later Lacan that capitalism mistakes desire for drive, right? So there is a sense in which these two forms that Marx is talking about, that money puts on us, like these demands, either the demand that we can actually have something that we want to do in the world, or that if we don't, we're left to um, formulating a conception of need that is like barred from us in some sense. I mean, we could read these passages, it's quite powerful. But I was wondering if what folks think about that, like how you might theorize um, how desire would fit into this, right? And the frustration that this develops. Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, so it's interesting to think about like the other like in this, of course, but even besides that, it's interesting how he is like anthropomorphizing money itself, right? In a way, it seems like. But yeah, I thought this was an interesting passage on page 138 because it ties into what we were earlier talking about with society, right? And the root problem of society being private property, but on 138 he says it's also money, right? So, uh, kind of that middle paragraph. If money is the bond binding me to human life, binding society to me, binding me and nature and man, is not money the bond of all bonds? Can it not dissolve and bind all ties? Is it not therefore the universal agent of divorce? It is the true agent of divorce as well as the true binding agent, the universal galvano-chemical power of society. So
Yeah.
against my anthropomorphizing here, making it a chemical as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, also this universal aspect, money. I mean,
Well,
this certainly
that's the thing. It's that I looked up that reference to the galvano chemical. That's kind of like a it's like a coating that you put on a bathtub that covers the entirety of the tub and gives it a certain look, a certain, right? So therefore, um, you could say money fosters the non-relation of society. So money divorces society, right? So if the revolution is about the construction of a completely new society, money is about this this disillusion, this kind of constant, and that then is why it's a fictional construct, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I'd like for folks interested in psychoanalysis to jump in here with thoughts, but that's really helpful. Let's go to Tariq next.
Yeah, I think there's like two parts. I think one part pertaining to the whole book as a whole, and the other part I think will kind of like perhaps drive this in a psychoanalytic direction if people are interested in that. And I think thinking about reading this, thinking about how this part fits into the whole book, I think we have to really pay attention to the line at the bottom of 138 where Marx says, money is the alienated ability of mankind. And so, we spent all this time thinking about alienation, alienated labor, and estrangement. It appears that whatever money is, it is what all those possibilities that could exist were it not for the laborer having to work. And so that's why, he gets into all these discussions around, smartness, ugliness, like uh, all these other discussions around what one could do if they have money. And this is what I think ties into the kind of psychoanalytic part is on 39, he says, what money does is converts my wishes from something in the realm of imagination, translates them from their mediated, imaginated, or willed existence into their sensuous, actual existence, from my imagination to life, from imagined being to real being. And, in this way, like he says earlier, like if I'm ugly and I have money, then there's a basic way in which I'm no longer ugly because I can pay for people to affirm my beauty. Or if I'm stupid, but I have money, then there's a basic way where I'm not stupid because I can pay for people's labor power, labor time, and profit off of the things that they make and say that that's me and that's my intelligence and my genius. And I think one of the really interesting things here with regards to the desire point is that, he says, no doubt demand exists for him who has no money, but this demand is a mere thing of the imagination without effect or existence for me, for a third party or for others, and which therefore remains unreal and objectless. And so there's a basic way in which if you don't have money, you don't have desire. Like that seems to really be a really basic point, I think, for Marx, is that in a really basic way, whatever desire is has to be cashed out literally with this object. And if you don't have that object, then you really can't have desire. And I think it's really, really powerful. I mean, you think about like how we talk about things today, like, like we always say things like, we wish we could do X, Y, and Z, but we know that those things that are things that we can't do because we just can't afford them. And so you really can see how, like, without having any money, you really aren't even allowed to have, like, you aren't even allowed to have the desire for, beauty. You're not allowed to have the desire for something like intelligence. And I think we live in a culture that's kind of predicates itself on that. Like, I know that I don't have this much money, so like, yeah, that's just not a life that's available for me. And so I think that
Yeah.
those are some of the moments that I think are kind of key and important to think about with regards to not just how not just how the text fits in with the rest of the text, but what it is Marx is kind of saying about desire more broadly.
Yes. No, I really like that because in the opening section, he wants to go beyond anthropological phenomena to get at what he calls the ontological basis of passion and feelings. And then he says, what philosophers in Hegelian left Hegelian orientation, including Feuerbach, but even though Feuerbach's like reached the highest pinnacle, he's not fully there yet, is that they haven't situated a conception of ontological need that would be granted a certain philosophical priority. Rather, they abstract it into a question of contemplation and thinking. Okay. And even Feuerbach does that. So again, I don't see how he's mired or caught within Feuerbachian agenda here, but we can talk about that later. But you're totally right, and there's so much to be said here. Gosh, I mean, on demand, on the theory of demand, I mean, obviously the first thing I'll say, and then I'll go immediately to Andrew, is the way in which a lot of psychoanalytic theorists will talk about how demand is artificialized or instrumentalized in, like, in the culture industry thesis, for example. I think here in this instance, because Marx is dealing with a different status of the suffering of the worker, he's not confronting a form of capitalism in which demand is generated like that. So that's something for us to sort of think through. But Andrew, please jump in.
Yeah, that was really good, Tyreek and Daniel. Hi everybody. Yeah, I think as far as like there's a psychoanalytic take on it, I feel a lot more comfortable and expressing like what I'm reading and reading this text. I really like what Tyreek said about money. Like if so long as money is there, it's like you have desire. But what is it that the worker is always lacking? Wage or money. And it's like the misrecognition and the imaginized form of their position in capital, because they don't see themselves as lacking capital, but lacking money. And so that perpetuates their desire because in psychoanalysis, desires lack. And as Lacan will say, desire is not the demand for love, nor is it need, but the subtraction between the two, the difference between the two. And so like how you said, Daniel, there's like the culture industry or just the way that the production of capitalism sets up on the base of the worker, there is this sort of reinscription of a demand. And that's kind of like what the signifier does in Lacan as well. But I think what I'm trying to get at without getting too lost in the tangent, because I think it's interesting to play upon the two psychoanalysis with libidinal economy and political economy, because this is one of the things that I have a hard time grappling with. For Lacan and Freud, it's like there's constitutional alienation on the subject versus like there's alienation based upon like labor and the product and capital. But I think they kind of play in when you get money involved, because then it alienates them further because of desire versus the logic of the drive, which I think is homologous with the logic of capital as like the MCM or the CMC, which are the elementary logics of the drive of capital, because there is an elementary logic, which is drive, that desire tries to fight from on the level of the unconscious. And it's a sort of an inertia. As Lorenzo Chiesa says, it's like there's it's a it's a tension or a deadlock that suspends enjoyment, but yet enjoyment still tries to further itself by trying to enjoy and desire like full enjoyment.
It's true, because in a Lacanian understanding of desire functions on what he calls a metonymic basis, which means that it functions on a kind of register of a system of difference. And then if you look at what Marx says here, he says, does not my money transform all my incapacities into their contrary, into their opposites? Yeah, it's the same thing. If money is the bond binding me to human life, binding society to me, binding me in nature and man, is not money the bond of all bonds? But you see, it's a bond of divorce. It's a bond that produces its opposite. It's a bond of fiction, right? And so there is a sense in which, in psychoanalytic theory, desire is also never at rest. Like there's no sense of desire reaching a kind of full satiation or something like this, right? And that actually is bound to Freud's later theory, obviously, of the pulsional notion of the drive and how that's bound up with that, which we're not going to obviously get into. But nonetheless, it's useful as a reference point to look at some of this, because I think a lot of psychoanalytic theorists don't consider the 1844 manuscripts, and maybe they should. You know what I'm saying? I think that's one of the big things I'm getting here. Andrew, did you want to say more?
Oh no, definitely. But I think that's like, that was really good. Like the main thing is like the way that money kind of just we misrecognize, the broader scope and the relation of the class antagonism because we're so preoccupied with desire because of money that we misrecognize our position. And I'm saying
Yeah,
from a psychoanalytic perspective, there's an
yeah,
imaginization that kind of mystifies the deadlock.
yeah,
Can I
yeah, yeah.
respond to that really quickly? If
Please,
that's okay. But I
please.
think the other thing too, I think to really consider is that in as much as money is the alienated ability, it's not just the fact that like, you're caught up and you're estranged in your work, but money is the place where the worker finds themselves able to purchase those possibilities that are estranged and covered up in work. And it's a fictitious purchasing of those possibilities because you're not actually, you're not actually laboring, but it's through money that the worker feels like they can build the identity that they lose in working because they're building an identity that has nothing to do with them, has to do with a product that has nothing to do with them. But yeah, that's just kind of what I wanted to contribute there because I think
Yeah.
that's the important, I think, connection between the stuff we were talking about on labor and how the worker relates to labor themselves. I mean, how the
Yes.
worker relates to their use of money. It's through purchasing things that they, feel like they're purchasing these possibilities that are foreclosed when they make themselves into a commodity.
Yes. Yes, exactly. What is it that is imagined by me? What is it that the money relation allows me to imagine is a proof for Marx that there is this Spinozist, I think, cognito, there's this third object. There's this other what he calls real object. So again, money makes possible the cognition of that, of the existence of that, even though it splits division between those who can have a relationship of thinking that in their alienation form, which is why later he'll say, yeah, sure, Feuerbach can resolve the contradictions of religion, but only in thought. And what you're left with is still a alienated subject in Feuerbach's view at the end of his movement. It's actually almost worse because it's almost like you went to like a super fancy yoga camp all weekend, but then you got to go back to like working at the factory. So it's like all you've really done in Feuerbach's sense is giving yourself souped up self-help to help you, if that makes sense. Okay, go ahead, Leah.
Yeah, I don't, this is the kind of the section I wanted to talk about too. I don't know. Other people said pretty much what I thought, but I guess uh when I read this section, this here on 138 that we keep referring to, like I couldn't help but just continuing to think of Dostoevsky. And this he's got that story, The Double. You've got this guy who's just like kind of this lame, miserable creep, and nobody likes him. He's not good at his job. He has no friends, But then this kind of other appears who is conceivably like him in every sense, but somehow he has charisma. He gets along with people. He does well. And he can see, praises and, promises of more money, like all of these things that he hopes to achieve kind of showered on this other guy, and it creates this sort of like breakdown, obviously. And I think what this section really does is, in this kind of very literary language, it shows that, yeah, you might be able to kind of, in a sense, reap the benefits of having intelligence, being attractive, being charismatic, what have you, um, which are, supposedly kind of these, objects of desire, but that ultimately what you want is to be the person who would have, who would have those things. But because you did not earn them, there's a sense that you've just kind of projected, yeah, there's kind of this I don't know if you'd want to call it like a reinscription, but kind of over the surface of yourself, you have now this ideal image of yourself that the money creates the illusion of. That's its like magical power. And so whatever, you might get out of that, it isn't really yours. It belongs to this kind of false self that's now on top of you. And there's always going to be that split, and I don't know, just it's really interesting how it kind of
Yeah.
really pulls out the sort of Faustian way in which you kind of cuck yourself out of your own self-development. I don't know. And that made it make sense too, why, the goal is this reappropriation of self, because in, kind of money has the ability to bring you to this place that you are not really at in terms of your own self-development. And so you've, yeah, just basically in that pursuit kind of retarded yourself. And that the
Right.
idea is to like, I don't know. I think it's a really powerful section, and it's fun to
Yeah.
kind of see Marx in this
No,
writing in
it's
this
really good.
literary way too.
I mean, there's a lot of things in here. Like Marx is talking about human capacities. Marx is talking about individuality. These are not supposed to be Marxist words, right? I was reading the speeches of Marx and Engels at this time, and while they're experimenting with tethering to the rights of man as a discourse, like fraternity, liberty, equality, one of the things that Marx says is that our vision of a liberated society will be full like liberty so that a new equality could come. But he says we should be skeptical about relying on a bourgeois conception of equality, which I found really interesting as a revolutionary tactic. Matilda, please.
Okay, I found this money section really interesting in relation to the Hegel section, because he says that logic is the money of the mind. He also says that Hegel's standpoint is that of modern political economy. And I think what he means by that is that it's essentially egoistic. The subject of Hegel is self-consciousness, self. It is not a collective thing like what Feuerbach adds to the thing. Feuerbach is the one who introduces the social powers of man and how those are abstracted, but he doesn't put it in a historical process. And I think that's what Marx is doing here, is taking the Feuerbach's principles, these social powers, and placing them back into the Hegelian dialectic. And what happens in that, if you go back to the top of the power of money, says, if man's feelings and passions are not merely anthropological, that is not merely just within inside oneself or one human, this is how I read it in the narrow sense, but truly ontological affirmations. The problem with Hegel is that when Hegel goes through his dialectic, he posits from self-consciousness, he posits consciousness like some object, and then it's recognized to be self-consciousness again, and it comes back into this negativity that is also individualistic and egoistic. And it just seems like Marx it's just as simple as just putting a new subject within the Hegelian dialectic, and he has this revelation. And that's what I find crazy, is like, it seems like he retains the Hegelian dialectic and just incorporates a new piece of material into it, such that what is actually alienated in this process are real things, and it has a connection with nature. And like, that's why at the end of the Hegel section, he's so keen on saying that like nature has no meaning for Hegel in any substantial way. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, totally. It's like what is it? It's a total like negativity, or it's a kind of empty space. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's so correct. I think you're totally correct. Let's go to Connor.
Yeah, so I'm kind of just like thinking out loud. Maybe my psychoanalysis is a little dusty, but in any case, I'm just like trying to make this connection, or I'm thinking along the lines of like, where is repression at work for Marx here? Because like on its face, obviously not having money has to do with a form of repression, but like, you know, especially repression in regards to like the superego in psychoanalysis has to do with like a renunciation of desires, certain desires, etc. And that's not what's going on here once you have money, right? Like, which is to say that there's something here like, in other words, for psychoanalysis, right, the satisfaction of desire like cannot be met because certain desires need to be renounced. But satisfaction here for Marx cannot be satisfied because money, it's there's something too excessive about it, right? Like as he says on 140, um, it because it can be exchanged, it is not exchanged for any one specific quality, for any one specific thing, or for any one particular human essential power, which is to say that it's always satisfying like more than what it is intended to satisfy, right? Or you can never get to just the thing. And this is because alienation, a misrecognition of the object of what money is, etc. But then this leaves open the question like, if we were to have unalienated relationships, could we satisfy things directly and immediately? Like, I don't think that's something psychoanalysis is going to say, right? So it's interesting to, this might not make sense at all, but these analogies or these homologies seem to like break down at some point between Marx and psychoanalysis. So
That's really interesting. I mean, I feel like Ernst Bloch's conversation in the principle of hope gets us a little bit closer, especially in his notion of the anticipated consciousness and the revolutionary consciousness, and his whole idea that um where he argues that Freud doesn't have a theory of the unconscious as futural. So I think, let's say, like, if Marx is a psychoanalytic thinker, he's going to be Blochian. He's not going to be Freudian or Jungian or Lacanian, right? In the sense that what Marx is really after is tapping into the not yet conscious. Marx is interested in how we can reignite what the Jacobins did, right? And he's reading all of like his Rousseau. He's reading revolutionary history of French Revolution. Like that's what this is about. It's a like at the very end, he says what the world would be like, right? It would be non-contradictory. If you want to enjoy art, um, or no, sorry, assume man to be man and his relationship to the world to be a human one. Then you can exchange love only for love, trust for trust, etc. Right? So there's a sense in which, yeah, like, okay, later we can ask the question, is it naive to posit a non-contradictory social bond, right? As communism? I mean, we have the luxury to posit that, but like part of what Bloch talks about with the not yet conscious is the uh, kind of optimistic of an affirmative basis of a future to come that only revolutionary consciousness can tap into. And I think that there's a way to think revolutionary consciousness that's like that. I've given talks on this before. I don't know if you guys have read this in Bloch, but I mean, like, honestly, I do think that it's only Bloch that would be able to speak to this, what Marx is talking about here. And I also furthermore think it's not fair to Marx to sort of ridicule this as uh, not, lacking. I mean, I think it's a revolutionary gesture. As such, it's not really meant to be a prognostication or program for a society. It's meant to be a theory for the development of a radically spontaneous new sensual sphere of public life and what that would look like. Um, it's communism as abolition of money. I mean, right? Right? Um, I don't know. What do you think, Tarek or Tariq?
Yeah, no, I was actually gonna turn to the ending because I think the ending is kind of, it is kind of gesturing at the kind of things that money obscures. And the examples I think are pretty interesting. Like, and I think the examples are interesting because it presupposes some other things that Marx isn't saying here about money, but we could infer. So, if he's saying that without money, and if we're thinking about man's relationship to man, in this way, then we kind of have love as love. Then we have, the ability to enjoy art. Then we have the ability for, what I really take to be like real politics or rhetoric, like the ability to kind of persuade people. Then what he seems to be saying, I think, underneath all that is, if we're taking his thesis correctly, that money reverses all these relationships, is that under a society of money, our relationships of love are obscured, our aesthetic relationships are obscured, and we definitely see this in our politics. Our politics are extremely obscured by these issues of money. Like, through money I can buy a fictitious love, through money I can buy an aesthetic taste, and through money I can buy political power. And it's really when that kind of mediator, this pimp figure that he's describing it as, it's really when that mediator is out that we can actually have these actual relationships of love, these relationships of aesthetics, and I think these powerful relationships of politics.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I wonder the symptom of our own neurosis to question that scenario, right? I mean, perhaps it is the weight of history that forces us to question the possible youthful naivete of a revolutionary gesture like that. Or perhaps it's not. I mean, perhaps because I think that Bloch's point in his historical studies of different revolutionary moments, right, where like you literally have the possibility of a revolutionary situation, that's the kind of stuff that he points to, that the consciousness, the collective consciousness, holds to forms of social possibility to come that is non-contradictory, right? And like, what's wrong with that in some sense? Like, could you have a kind of technocratic oriented revolution? I don't think that you could, right? Like, I don't think Ezra Klein is going to join our revolution. Ezra Klein will critique us, right? But do we need to use the superego of the liberal expert onto ourselves? And I don't think that we do, or at least not like that, like so viciously. I don't mean to push back too much on you, Connor, but I'm just simply saying, like, I wonder, like, why not have revolutionary optimism? Tara, please.
Hi. So, okay, I think I'm getting at what our question is here. So the immiseration thesis is, the basic premise is that the question of revolutionary consciousness, that just being forced into like a horrible material condition is what will bring about, right, revolutionary consciousness. Is that part of the nugget of it? And that this reading is helpful because in tracking the way that need or desire is itself emptied out for the worker, that the desire for revolution or even the imaginary of revolution is depleted, right? Like the horizon of revolution is potentially depleted. Because I'm linking back a lot. I really liked this section a bit earlier. I think it's on page 117, where or is it what? Yeah, 1 second. Where he talks about the cave.
117.
Yeah, this is like a few, like 2 sentences into the first big paragraph. Even the need for fresh air ceases for the worker. Man returns to living in a cave, which is now, however, contaminated with the mephitic breath of plaque given off by civilization, and which he continues to occupy only precariously, it being for him an alien habitation, which can be withdrawn from him any day, a place from which, if he does not pay, he can be thrown out any day. And then that follows that another section I've brought up before, that it is the moral idea. This is on 118. From the position of the political economist, the moral idea is the worker who takes part of his wages to the savings bank. And it has even found ready-made in abject art, which to clothe this, its pet idea, they have presented it based in sentimentality on the stage. Self-denial, the denial of life and all human needs, is its cardinal doctrine. I don't know if that applies to some sort of repression quality. I guess I'm finding this both incredibly illuminating and very terrifying in the kind of, I'm thinking about our built world, I'm thinking about taste and the way that, we flip everything like, oh, working class has terrible taste. Or, I mean this in the most reductive ways. I don't really mean this. Or I'm thinking about how ugly our world is becoming. And I'm thinking about how, the kind of ineffective desire removes the desire to kind of imagine a beautiful or imagine another. And it's starting to kind of make sense to me what a vicious cycle this is in terms of the kind of depletion of our kind of lived, of the sensuous world, in a way.
Yeah, it's really good. No, I mean, thank you for drawing that attention. I had forgotten the level of verve and intensity that Marx really discusses the removal of a conception of human need from the workers in this time period. I mean, yeah, 117 is extremely powerful. And again, I mean, the most significant and popular socialist at the time was imprisoned, William Waitling, and when he was released, Marx and Engels got into a major fight with him because he still wanted to, orientate himself around this Blanquist, conspiratorial idea, which actually, paradoxically, was disconnected from workers, but which also didn't care to really educate workers in a rigorous way about revolution. It was more of this kind of quasi-anarchistic, like setting things off and people will follow naturally. So it's kind of a strange theory of revolution that Marx ended up like fundamentally disagreeing with. And that's why I was saying in the opening, that's why actually Marx basically goes, no, we need to go back to a theory of bourgeois revolution from within the bourgeoisie only 2 years after this text. Okay. So he's breaking from this conspiratorial, artisanal based petty bourgeois form of revolution, which they will come later in 1848 to call the true socialists, right? Now, can we then retroactively say that like Marx's political praxis in the 1844 manuscripts is null and void? Of course, I don't think we can say that because that's merely a shift in strategy. Because for me, Marx is a thinker of political strategy. That's like one of his best gifts to socialism, right? And just, yeah, I think that you're really hitting on something very compelling. And I think that the idea of the changing valences of immiseration are super essential. But Takin has had his hand up for so long. I want to go, please.
So I just wanted to go back to the discussions about like desire, psychoanalysis, money, stuff like that. So I was just thinking about things from a more Deleuzian perspective, so radically, obviously anti-psychoanalysis. And like it's interesting when you think about money in this sense, the way that Marx describes it, because if we think of desire not as lack, like psychoanalysis and literally everybody thinks of, but as production, the way Deleuze and Guattari think of it, then you have to think, in what sense is the worker capable of producing as in desiring, right? And it's really interesting when you think of money, how money fits in there, because as Marx puts it, money is like the mediator, the pimp, right? And it's interesting because a pimp is exactly the mediator in a non-productive relationship, which is sex work, which is like not productive in that sense. Um, so what I was, that's why I kept lowering and raising my hand, because I was just thinking it through. And so for the worker, the way I was just thinking about it was, um, so the worker is in a non-productive state because he can't produce, and we've seen this previously, like in alienated labor, estranged labor, whatever it's called. Like he's not only estranged from production, but now he's incapable of it. And one of the reasons is this money mediator. And for Deleuze, whenever there's an interruption in desire, in machines, in and that sort of like momentum, and that's that whole thing together is what he calls life, living, sort of Nietzschean in that sense. He calls any interruption death. So I think maybe it's a stretch, but I think in an anti-Oedipal perspective, money would even be sort of like death producing, or an interruptive force by nature, because it stops it interrupts the worker's capacity to produce, which is both productive and desiring. And then if you look at the capitalist, it's even more interesting when you look at the capitalist with money, because the capitalist also ends up being in a non-productive relationship with himself and with the worker, because the capitalist doesn't end up having a sort of Deleuzian desire process where one desire leads into the next one and it returns onto the body and then it merges with the social reality, and it's just like this chain, this momentous chain of desires, because the capitalist is in this super cyclical backwards desire of money for itself. Like the desire for money always leads back to the desire for money. So I think in the in a Deleuzian anti-Oedipal perspective, like it's really interesting because for both the capitalist and the worker, money is a sort of interruptive force in like the in that whole sort of movement. And I know everybody's really interested in psychoanalysis, so I really recommend reading Anti-Oedipus if you haven't already, obviously.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very good. Yeah, because I think that's a very different idea than money as a phallic order. Because one could see that, uh, like in a Lacanian sense, the basis of my relationship to the symbolic um, is in a sense, if money were abolished, then that like whole fictional structure of how I would relate to having or being, that distinction between having and being itself, which is so essential um, in the Oedipal drama itself. That's what the Oedipal drama um, is about in a certain way. Well, that would actually change in a communist society, right? And so it's a very profound point. And I mean, I know that Deleuze and Guattari do discuss money in Anti-Oedipus, but I don't have the references immediately available. But it's very good. Connor.
Yeah, going back to something Tara said about repression and like beauty and how ugly this world is, etc. It just got me thinking. Um, yeah, going back to, I think one of the problems is for with money is that, our desire for money emerges from, among other things, the senses, right? A demand on the senses, like the eye wants something, the stomach wants something, what have you, right? And the thing about money is that it's too general, and this is what I mean by like it's too excessive. Like, it can satisfy all of those things, but at the same time, in a way, it doesn't satisfy any of them, right? And with that being said, on an aesthetic level, we tend to, or we can think of like the accumulation of money as being associated with like luxuriousness, right? Which is like an indulgence in the senses and so on. But what's going on here, and this touches on the repression part, I think the more that you kind of indulge in this luxuriousness and so on, the more you're like diminishing a sense of your affect and a relationship to your body. And this is when, in Adorno sense, like you could say luxuriousness capitulates to barbarism, right? What is supposed to be refined becomes an unrefinement of the senses, and so on. And if you like, we can even go a step further and go to Deleuze and say it's death producing, right? Insofar as it's barbarism. But yeah, just some things I was thinking.
Very good. Yeah, this is really excellent. I do want to make time to get to the section on the critique of the Hegelian dialectic and philosophy as a whole, but let's go to Matilda and then we will.
Oh, I like that. I like all the points that we're making. I was thinking about the person who has money, the subject with money, is able to access the products of the division of labor, which Marx says at this point in that section on the meaning of human requirements. The examination of division of labor and exchange is of extreme interest because these are perceptibly alienated expressions of human activity and of essential human power as a species activity and power. But the relationship of the subject to money is essentially an egoistic one. It is, money is a piece of private property, and the subject of money is able to access these alienated social powers through money. And it's kind of like that Hegelian self-conscious dialectic where it has the money, it goes out and takes it, but when it comes back to itself, it is still just like, it doesn't actually acquire those alienated social powers because somehow the relationship of money to these alienated powers is maybe not like, I don't know, there's something mediating between these things. And I found this section very interesting, just quickly, he says, the buying and selling is like the adequate form of exchange for egoistic subjects. But the necessary, this is just me kind of paraphrasing, but the necessary premise for this sort of exchange is private property. But private property is the product of labor. And if the division of labor and the use of machinery promote wealth production, then alienated labor is the necessary premise for this sort of exchange. Something like that, I don't know, just some points that were jumping around in my head.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So yeah, so I guess I could summarize this section by just throwing some summaries out there to get you all thinking and to encourage you to jump in and share your own reflections and notes and so on. But basically the conversation is around three relationships to the Hegelian dialectic. First from Feuerbach, then from the young Hegelians, and then from Hegel himself. And Marx is aiming to arrive at the inadequacy of all three. He does this by showing these kind of three-part movements that are involved with each of these orientations. In essence, the young Hegelians end with a kind of complete, like the political economists, they have a theory of the rabble, which he says, I think that's quite interesting. I know that the rabble came up prior. I think it was Kent who mentioned it before. It is mentioned again. But they have no means to fully resolve the predicament of the rabble other than simply through consciousness or through thinking or through contemplation. And their negation of the negation does not establish itself. Therefore, it is just thinking surpassing itself in thinking, and as thinking wanting to be direct awareness of nature and reality. And this is because Hegel on 145 has only found the abstract, logical, speculative expression for the movement of history. And this historical process is not yet the real history of man as a given subject, but only man's act of genesis and the story of man's origin. So again, it's that given ontological essence of man tied to a theory of naturalism, right? That we talked about in the last section. Okay. That's what is missing in now. Feuerbach gets closer to that, but he ends his dialectical movement with sense certainty. And let's examine the shortcomings of that. Okay. What Feuerbach discovers is that one, philosophy is a form of religion that is rendered into thoughts. Two, that the establishment of a real science of philosophy must be based in an understanding of man to man, right? This goes back to that letter that Marx wrote to Feuerbach, which is, you have discovered the new science of socialism. Okay. But three, Feuerbach opposes the negation of the negation because he begins and ends with positive sense certainty. So therefore, and then Marx does the three movements of Feuerbach once again. He begins with estranged substance, rather, which he finds in religion and theology. Two, he annuls this infinite. He annuls this false infinite to establish the actual sensuous finite of a new reign of philosophy. And then three, he annuls the movement to reestablish a new form of religion and theology in the third movement. But again, this negation of the negation doesn't establish anything other than thinking surpassing itself. So that's the limitations of Feuerbach. And we then move to a longer exposition and conversation on the limitations of Hegel himself, which I can summarize as well. But the first error of Hegel is that these categories of like wealth, poverty, the state, power, he recognized as estranged from the human being. But philosophically, his only solution for the resolution of these estrangements is within thought, right? And that's why he says, quote on 147, the philosopher sets himself up as the measuring rod of the estranged world. The whole production of the alienation process is the abstract speculative thought. So the opposition that forms here is between in itself and for itself. This is held in consciousness and it is held in object and subject. But the problem is that this opposition again remains between abstract thinking and sensuous reality. So what is it that Marx is offering as an alternative to this? He's adding something to this, as I think Matilda mentioned earlier. And here's a good quote on 150 we can read. Maybe somebody would want to read this. It's starting with the real, active orientation of man to himself as a species being on 150. Is it one? Sorry, hold on. Let me see. Yes. The real active. No, where is it?
It's at the bottom of 149.
Thank you, my friend. Would you mind reading it, Kent? Yes, thank you. That's it.
The real active orientation of man to himself as a species being, or his manifestation as a real species being, that is, as a human being, is only possible by his really bringing out of himself all the powers that are his as the species being, something which in turn is only possible through the totality of man's actions as the result of history, is only possible by man's treating these generic powers as objects, and this, to begin with, is again only possible in the form of estrangement. I'm kind of forgetting if this is like him reconstructing Hegel's position, or if this is him differentiating his own position from Hegel.
It's still a description of Hegel's phenomenology.
Right.
So but it is also hinting at its inadequacy as I read it, of course. Because he goes on again on 150 to say why Hegel is one-sided. And this is where Tara or Matilda mentioned this notion of he has a standpoint in modern political economy because he grasps labor as the essence of man, as man's essence in the act of proving itself, but he only sees the positive, not the negative side of labor. The only labor that Hegel knows is abstract mental labor. So that's actually quite powerful, I think, because that actually would indicate why, and we see this in Lukács's book on the political economy of the young Hegel, which is very interesting, which is that why is it that Hegel has no concept to understand the problem of the modern worker, right? That's an interesting question. But yes, I mean, there's so much, and this is such a rich section. I want to invite others to jump in as they have questions on it, because we have this notion of the two errors that Hegel makes. The first is in the phenomenology about the origin, and what's the second error that the phenomenology makes? I think the second error is found on 148, if I'm not mistaken. How many people got through this section, by the way? Yeah. Yeah, I worked all the way through it as well. I've worked on the phenomenology as well, so it felt like quite graspable to me. But did others feel like it was sort of very difficult or very foreign, or were you confused? How about you, Kent?
I think the challenges for me were the details about negativity and positivity. It seemed like a lot of Marx's critique of Hegel has to do with like the way Hegel lands on a positive dialectic, which is not that far off given like the um the kind of labor it is required to form a political body, or the kind of associations that are historically associated with Marxism. But still, like the trying to conceive of negativity without launching into like a genealogy of different versions of dialectics, that's what to me made this section kind of challenging.
Yeah.
But at the same time, props to Marx for like making uh, a dialectical engagement like more accessible than I found in
Mm.
a lot of other writings. Um, I guess like I probably most of all because there's like he's so clear about the opposition between abstract thought and um and alienated labor. And so that's I guess, but as for like conclusions about it, geez, I don't know.
Well, in a way, the conclusion's pretty self-evident. When we drive home to I mean, if you could be sort of summarize it, right? The theory of estrangement that's on offer, right, does not adequately equip us with understanding the acute form of estrangement that Marx has spent the entire text elucidating, right? And therefore it's like um of another time. Like Hegel is dated, right? Hegel is like even more dated than many of the political economists like Ricardo and Say and Sismondi in terms of his understanding of estrangement. And so there's a sense in which that's pretty straightforward to me. Tariq, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think just like generally speaking, like, estrangement plays I mean, this is something I learned very quickly, uh, reading Hegel for the first time, uh, around like October to December last year, is that alienation and estrangement's kind of positive for Hegel because it's through alienation and estrangement that feel. For example, the connect in the care and connect relationship is able to then move into these, more developed
Yeah,
attitudes of stoicism, skepticism, and unhappy consciousness. And
right.
that's available to it because it's estranged in doing work, and it has to work off um its relationship to the hair. Whereas like with Marx, we're getting kind of like the inverse. I mean, this is really, you're really seeing, I think, why that expression is so popular, that Marx really puts Hegel on his head, because here we're seeing how, in fact, the estrangement that we find in work does not allow, the individual to find themselves in a position where they can continue to develop, but instead we get a kind of degradation into something that is, if we go back to that first manuscript on alienated labor, something that is inhuman, something that is more and more and more beholden to nature itself, like earning wages, just enough wages for, the worker to just merely live, just like any other animal.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something to kind of keep in mind, in terms of kind of the deficiency of the estrangement in Hegel compared to uh, what kind of role estrangement is playing for Marx.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that's really good because I mean, I think the most pivotal shift occurs on 150, where everything before 150 is a summary of the phenomenology. And then he then says, we shall now demonstrate in detail why all of this is one-sided, right? And that's where he says, okay, like that's why I marked 150. It's an important pivot point. And in this pivot, it's an acknowledgement that Hegel is absolutely a philosopher that is relevant to this inquiry of ours into political economy, because he bases his whole standpoint there. But then Marx goes on to show the limitations therein, um, and all of that uh, builds up to a conception of man and nature, and the inadequacy of Marx's theory of naturalism and ultimately of humanism, right? And that's really where Marx will bring the whole thing home, um, which I have some notes on that to talk about in a moment. But Matilda, go ahead.
Yeah, just a short, like, Hegel can't, Hegel's, the three-step dialectic, like, it can never, like, so there's this path of estrangement, and then there's this attempt to reappropriate the thing that's estranged. And like, and in Marx's sense, it's like real objects are being generated in the world, and like nature is being built up, and the reappropriation of those alienated and estranged powers are in fact, reappropriated in communism. And like they exist within nature, like as the built up industries, like the history of the industries is the open book of human psychology, is what he says in Private Property and Communism. Whereas the estrangement process in Hegel is esoteric or mystical still. It is negativity at the end of the day. Nature, as we see at the very end, doesn't actually exist for Hegel in a real way. And I think that's like
Right.
really
That's why he says. That's why he says Hegel's philosophy is occult, which is such an interesting phrase, um, because the truth of human estrangement is resolvable in knowledge and thought, and that is kind of like a mystical proposition, I guess. Um, all reappropriation of the estranged objective essence appears, therefore, for Hegel, as a process of incorporation back into self-consciousness. The man who takes hold of his essential being is merely the self-consciousness which takes hold of his objective essences. Um, and therefore, what he says on 153 is that uh, like the status of the human subject in the drama of lordship and bondage in the master-slave dialectic from the Phenomenology, which I'm sure all of you have read, is that thinghood cannot be anything but alienated self-consciousness, which means that man creates a world that is externalized and therefore not of his own essential being. Like that is what Tariq says of the drama of alienation as a necessary movement through the stages of the drama of spirit in history. But Marx says that Hegel doesn't understand what it means to have being truly outside of yourself, which I think is a really interesting point, and where Marx basically adds like, yeah, Feuerbach is right that it's sensuousness, but it's also hunger, it's also need, it's also a different, like it's more than just sensuousness. Okay, and that's the theory of naturalism. Charles, please jump in.
Yeah, I'm just confronting this criticism really for the first time. It's I've seen so much of Hegel in the text so far that it's kind of surprising when he says some of these things later. But and then of course we get the fact on page 114 that he basically says communism is the negation of the negation. So trying to figure out, well, how is he using it there as opposed to the way he's criticizing Hegel. But what Tariq said about alienation maybe being insufficient in Hegel, I just have a hard time, or estrangement. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around this to some degree because, like, for instance, in the master-slave dialectic that you just mentioned, you get right at the heavy point, you know, it's like the slave has experienced the melting away of everything, the absolute melting away of everything stable, which Hegel calls absolute Flüssigwerden alles Bestehens. Now, this absolute melting away, it is absolute knowledge estranged from itself. It's the real thing. Die Sache selbst. Experienced, or absolute knowledge experienced as an external thing. So it sees itself and can't even recognize itself. So it's experiencing itself as in alienation. And then also the negation of negation itself, which pops up in the introduction of phenomenology as the criterion, you know, how we're going to proceed. But these movements between the dialectical phases are a kind of action, you know, that picks up, you know, an absolute nothingness. All of a sudden, through off Hebung, a new concept appears. And in this appearance of the new concept, it immediately falls apart into a new world and a new subject. And the world that is present in a new concept is the former dialectic now turned into an object. And the new consciousness goes to work on that. But this whole process, as Hegel mentions, is a pathway of despair. It keeps crashing over and over and over again. It's almost as if each consciousness has a bad attitude. It thinks its limited concept is the concept with a capital C. And the harder it tries to hang on to its notion or concept, the more things slip between its fingers and it falls away into absolute nothingness, which necessitates more dialectical action. But you see what I'm saying? It's almost like to say that Hegel is lacking alienation and estrangement seems a little weird to me. So, but I'm still processing this, and hopefully that makes some kind of sense.
Yeah. On 114, the communism as negation of negation is the annulment of private property through communism. So it is a clarification, we remember, of these 3 or 4 different forms. There's equalitarian, there's political, and then there's kind of religious forms, but each of them are still kind of qualified as communism because they are negating private property. But not all of them have a negation of a negation. Not all of them adequately work through private property. Like Proudhon, he doesn't, he just universalizes private property. So that's what I understand that. It's Marx's treatment of a more thorough uh, annulment of private property on 114. And everything else you said was fabulous. I think some folks have some comments on it. Kent, did you want to jump in?
I mean, Terry, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I'm not. I just wanted to, because I think everything Charles says is like spot on. I guess I should kind of clarify a bit. Is like what I meant was in Hegel, it's because of estrangement and alienation that we can get this kind of we can kick like Daniel was saying, we can kick off this process that will inevitably lead to absolute knowing. And so with what Charles was just saying just now about how, where the worker, in this case the connector, the slave, is alienated in doing their work, it's an extremely miserable thing. Hegel's very clear about that. But it's the Eigensinn, the stubbornness of belonging in that relation, and trying to work it off, that lets the connect to enter into these attitudes of stoicism, skepticism, and unhappy consciousness, which eventually leads to reason, and et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a manner in which the kind of estrangement and alienation that we find in Hegel ultimately leads to something much more productive and much more generative. Whereas I think with Marx, what we're seeing is something different, where like what we find in alienation and estrangement is not this kind of process whereby, we're going towards something more generative, but instead a kind of real degradation from what, from the human being to something more animal. So I hope that kind of clarifies or makes sense.
That actually goes right into what I wanted to talk about too, which is like how to me it seems like a big part of Marx's critique of Hegel is like Hegel's position at when absolute knowledge is self-consciousness, and then therefore that like self-consciousness is an object. Like self-consciousness can't just be the object of all work, I guess. Is so I'm thinking about page 150 and 151. And it to me it seems like it kind of connects back to what Tara was saying, where there's the political economists, like one of the basic presuppositions that Marx has issue with the political economists is it always has to objectify something at some point. And Hegel, since he's objectifying abstract thought itself, that's like the philosophical counterpart that the like political economies flow from, in terms of like having an abstract idea about human life that doesn't uh consider estrangement or alienation. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I think 153 really shows that in a simple sense, what Marx is saying is that Hegel simply doesn't understand with enough gravity and force the theory of alienation qua thinghood, right? In the dialectic. Because he doesn't understand what Marx says at the bottom of 153, the real corporeal man with his feet firmly on the solid ground, man exhaling and inhaling all the forces of nature, establishes his real objective essential powers as alien objects by his externalization. It is not the act of positing which is the subject in this process. That's what Hegel would say, right? It is the subjectivity of objective essential powers whose action, therefore, must also be something objective. So you see, this is where Hegel doesn't have that, right? A being who is objective acts objectively, and he would not act objectively if the objective did not reside in the very nature of his being. So again, we're back to this question of the creation of objects, and because at bottom he is nature, in the act of establishing, therefore, this objective being does not fall from his state of pure activity into a creating of the object. On the contrary, his objective product only confirms his objective activity, establishing his activity as the activity of an objective natural being. And then I highlighted this passage. Here we see how consistent naturalism or humanism distinguishes itself both from idealism and materialism. So, you see what that means? It distinguishes itself both from idealism, Hegel, and materialism, Feuerbach, right? Constituting at the same time the unifying truth of both. We also see how only naturalism is capable of comprehending the act of world history. So there it is right there, right? That's that's Marx's naturalism. Go ahead. Somebody had their hand up. Yeah, Matilda, please.
Yeah, it seems to me like this path of estrangement for Marx is like the splitting, somehow objectification turns into alienation at some point. Or it just started with alienation, and there's this separation between the worker and private property. And as the worker works, it empties itself out into this other, and it continues this process, and it both develops its own senses in this alienation, and what we see in history is the growing division of labor. We see these industries growing up and becoming perfected. These industries are the essential powers of humans in different ways. It's their different senses developed in these different ways into a high degree. And then what we see at the end is this realization that is happening in Marx in real time as we're reading this, that like, oh my gosh, like the history of the economy is the history of the open book of the human powers, and that like money somehow has been functioning throughout this process to keep us in this sort of sleep while we go through this process. And then he realizes that, I mean, and I don't know exactly, but like Hegel is like bourgeois ideology. Like he is starting from the premises of political economy, which is private property and egoism as something essential to humans. And he sees in that section on society that we started off with, like, oh gosh, like these people are wrong, and he starts to critique these political economists in their own terms, like how could these? I don't have the demonstration on down pat, but like more or less, he's coming to this realization that that it's anyway, I can't go.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy what he's saying here, which is, what does it mean to think this dialectic on 155 as what he calls unbeing, right? Or sort of nullity. And he says, suppose a being which is neither an object itself nor has an object. Such a being in the first place would be the unique being. There would exist no being outside it. It would exist solitary and alone, for as soon as there are objects outside me, as soon as I am not alone, I am another reality than the object inside me. And then this is the third object. For this third object, I am thus another reality than it. That is, I am its object. Thus, to suppose a being which is not the object of another being is to presuppose that no objective being exists. So he's arriving at this form of objectification, which Feuerbach talks about objectification. We already looked at the theory of alienation early on in the text, in the second section, as a theory of objectification. But here it's different. And then I want to see what folks make of this notion of suffer. To be sensuous is to suffer. Man as an objective sensuous being is therefore a suffering being. And because he feels what he suffers, a passionate being. Passion is the essential force of man, energetically bent on its object. That then takes us back to the liberated notion of what would the love be love, right? Which would be this liberated desire in some sense that the annulment of private property could allow, right? So this is quite powerful because he's saying that that neither Feuerbach or Hegel, as I read it, incorporate a conception of man at this level. And then Marx is going to drive in on 156. Let's dig into this. Into this kind of well, here he's really sort of I think for the first time adequately building beyond Hegel in some sense with this new naturalism in place. And it gets quite technical. I mean, it looks like there's 5 different movements at work here. I'm not sure if we have the time, given we are a bit over time, to run through them all. We certainly could. What I noted in conclusion, and by the way, we will meet one more time, by the way, and I'm still waiting to confirm a speaker, but I'm very, very hopeful that we're going to have an excellent speaker. I'm sure that we will. So, but I don't have it confirmed yet for next time, but I hope to have that soon. What I wanted to draw attention to was this question of yeah, like what is I mean, where is this continued in Marx, right? Like if the thesis on Feuerbach represents a kind of pivot away from this naturalist dialectic, I want to actually ask, like, if that's true, and if this can be read as almost like a kind of unfinished or abandoned form of Marx or part of Marx. I don't know what y'all think about that. But I don't know. Do you guys have more time, or shall we call it a night and sort of pick up from where we're at to sort of, because I guess there's like 5 pages left, and probably we should pick up from next time. Yeah, let's pick up from next time because it's late and I want to respect everybody's time. So I'll be in touch with details on that, but I think we should bring this home in a proper way. Now I'm realizing since we have yeah, about 5 or 6 pages left. Yeah, thank you, Charles. And we'll bring it back. And if you can't make it next time, we can absolutely put it on YouTube for everybody to watch. But this has been so nice, guys. I mean, I've really, really learned a hell of a lot.
Yeah, this has been great. I've always wanted to sit down and like get to the whole manuscript, so it's nice.
Yeah, we did it. Yeah, we did it. But I feel like let's meet again and finish it off completely and even raise. I mean, I'll send around the thesis on Feuerbach as well. Folks can read it, and we can perhaps add that to our discussion.
Yeah, that would be really great.
What were those 2 letters
Cool.
you mentioned at the beginning?
Say it again.
What were those 2 letters from Marx and Engels that you, or like the speech from Marx and then the letter by Engels?
Yeah, that was Engels' speech in Eberfeld, a famous speech, and then the other one was Marx's address to the Communist League. Yeah, those are the 2. Okay. All right, my friends and comrades, all the best. Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
Good
guys.
night.